Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Barry Nicholsberg. I am Chief Development Officer at the Carter Center's Office of Estate and Gift Planning. Joining me is Mark Williams. He is a Senior Development Associate, and he's also a Trust and Estates Attorney. He and I have been leading webinars on behalf of the Carter Center on estate planning once a month since assessment. If you are interested in getting any of those, we can send you links. Eventually they will be on the Carter Center website, but we're having some trouble with that, but we can certainly send you links. We started with the Secure and CARES Acts and an explanation. We then went on in June to talk about wills. In July, we talked about everything except wills. We then moved on in August to trusts. Last month, September, we talked about insurance and annuities. And now we're talking about donor advised funds. And I simply want to say thank you. For those of you who have been with us before, thanks for coming back. If you haven't been to one of these, you're going to be drinking from a fire hose in a very short period of time. I especially want to thank you for your trust and confidence in the Carter Center and allowing us an hour of your time so that we can help you understand what we're doing and give you some options about what you might want to do. I will do a very quick plug here for next month's webinars. They will be on the 16th and 18th of November, and we will be talking about ethical wills. So we have lots of things going on, lots of things planned, and we're just delighted to have you with us. With that, I want to thank Natasha Roberts, who is our Assistant Director and is working behind the scenes to make sure graphically we look pretty good and sort of keeping control on just about everything we do. And finally, I would like to thank our guest speaker today, Don Greene, and I will be introducing him in just a moment. But before I do, I'd like to turn this over to Mark, who will give the lawyerly disclaimer.
Always the most fun place to be able to take it over from you, Barry. What I'll do and start is just say, we really want to just make clear this is an educational webinar, so everything that we're talking about today is something that if you feel like it applies to you, please do talk with your own estate planning attorneys, your financial advisors. But one of the other things, besides all of this disclaimer stuff, one of the things we really did want to talk about was this is actually a really complicated subject matter. This next bit of series that we're going to be doing has deep policy implications, and there are many types of planning personnel or professionals out there who come at this from different routes. And want you to just think about this from the very beginning. Please do try to keep an open mind and recognize, there may not be just one answer or solution to some of the things that it is we're talking about here today. But the point is really to help you to become more informed and to help you to be able to be capable of using the information we're talking about to really put your philanthropy in play and to have the impact that it is that you want to have. So just a quick note that with us Monday will be Mr. Chuck Collins. He is going to be the speaker who will help us discuss some of the other uses of donor advised funds and some potential reforms that may be coming. But with that, I'm happy to actually turn it back over to you, Barry, to please go ahead with our introductions. And I'll go ahead and please let everyone know about Don Greene. I don't want them to have to just read this bio here on the screen.
I'm going to make this very simple. I've been in this business for 46 years, and there are a handful of people, and I mean a handful, who are not just savvy and understand the side of the not-for-profit, but also understand the donor side and have studied it in depth. And Don Greene is one of those people. We are delighted to have him with us. Donor advised funds have never been a really controversial thing, but it's getting that way. And before it gets out of hand, we at the Carter Center would like to address some of these things in anticipation that we may be able to hold back the water, if you will. So with that, Dawn, I want to thank you very, very much. Dawn is a member of the Carter Center's Philanthropy Council, and I want to thank you for that time as well. And Dawn, let's kick this off with a question. I'd like to know if you could just start by talking about what a donor-advised fund is, what kind of impact they may be having, and how do they work?
Sure. And Barry, let me first just start by saying thank you to you and to Mark and the Carter Center both for this discussion, but really taking the lead bringing this topic up for discussion. Donor advised funds are in some ways not understood, misunderstood, and in some corners very well understood. But at very simple terms, what they are is it's a collection of donors who individually come to make a charitable contribution. Their contributions are then pooled within a charity that hosts those donor advised funds. And those donor advised funds are then segregated for reporting purposes, but allow the donor to remain as an advisor to their contribution, suggesting to which charities those funds should ultimately be distributed, in what amounts, at what timing, etc. So a couple of thoughts. They have become so much of a topic of discussion for a couple of very good reasons. One, they are the fastest growing charitable endowed vehicle in the charitable sector, and they have been for decades, about a 15% annual growth rate per year. But also because they offer tremendous benefit to the sector, both to donors and nonprofits alike, where to the donors, they're giving the ability for a very simple way for them to engage in a charitable deduction in an endowed vehicle that allows them to continue their giving, whether it's immediate or over time. It gives them the ability to scale and leverage off of technology and innovation, a customization flexibility for how they give, to whom they give, and ultimately a simplicity to their lives that, when you boil it all down, leaves more resource for charities and ultimately simplifies their act of giving to focus really on the impact of their giving and not everything you might have to build around. The one other thing I'd share as I think about donor advised funds, there are a couple of restrictions or thoughts about them, how they are different than charities and other types of giving vehicles. Number one, there is an issue of control. So as a donor makes a contribution, they are giving up stewardship of those assets. Those assets become the property of the donor advised fund. But importantly, they maintain an informal advisor's role to give guidance as to which charities, which amounts, and what timing should receive those funds. Number two, donor advised funds are not to be used as a way to give out partial gifts. For example, you can't attend a benefit and claim a 50% benefit for the meal and 50% going for charitable purposes. You can't do those gifts at all. You also, by the same virtue, can't make any type of a grant from a donor advised fund that connotes a personal benefit to you or to somebody who's close to you. For example, tuition for a student who happens to be in your family, funding for a mission overseas for someone, or a membership at a golf club or some other nonprofit where there's a connotation back of personal benefit. And then last but not least, there's also a restriction on grants to individuals generally, where private foundations have the liberty, if they choose, to pay out either scholarships directly to individuals or other types of grants, need-based grants, et cetera. Donor advised funds are prohibited from that.
Dawn, how many people generally, what percentage of people you know who are setting up donor advised funds understand those rules going in?
It's a great question, Barry. I think in fairness, the year before they meet us, most of them have never heard of a donor advised fund. So the education depth by the time they get to us is fairly thin. However, they've usually come to us not directly, but in partnership with an advisor, trust and estate attorney, could be a tax accountant, could be a financial advisor, some other support. So they usually come with a peer-based or a third-party experience or perspective. And then as they come to us, part of the challenge with the donor advised fund is, as part of our engagement and account opening, they have to sign off on a disclosure and understanding of all those components. So I would say coming in the door, maybe half of them are aware of the restrictions or have a sense. And by the time they've signed on, they're all explicitly aware and confirming with us that they understand all the restrictions. The other piece I'll share with you, Barry, that if that missed you coming in the door, every time you go to make a grant, you are required to indicate that, in fact, you understand the restrictions and that the funds you're putting forward in no way have the purposes that are prohibited behind them. the charity that's receiving those also has to confirm that as a condition of their receipt of the funds.
Thank you. We have a chart on the next slide I'd like you to address.
Sure.
I think we're getting there. There we are.
Great. One of my favorite charts. So let me walk you through. When I talk to folks, I like to explain. We always start with two main principles. Number one, people do not make more wealth by giving it away. As a starting point, simple concept, but one to keep in mind. But as importantly, if you looked at the left-hand side of this chart, we live in the most charitable country in the world. And this chart makes that very clear. What you'll see on the top half is the percentage of households of high net worth or wealth that give to charities, 90% on average per year. Down below is the average for the US, 56%. Those numbers are unmatched in the world. So we have an incredibly generous charitable spirit in the US that, frankly, all of us generally participate in. You will see that there's a split between their support for secular orgs and religious orgs, but fundamentally, you have a broad-based contribution mentality and people looking for vehicles other than government to directly apply charitable intent, charitable outcomes. Now, as you move over to the right-hand side of the slide, this chart, each of these vertical pipes, if you will, or bars, represents the total amount given to U.S. charities by different sources. The biggest bar being that of individuals, and as you scale down, foundations, bequests, and then corporations. And what you'll see over time is that our commitment to charity in the U.S. hasn't just been about giving money to charities to use for tomorrow, but it's also been about giving money for use down the road and recognizing there's an intent in many cases to endow or give some longevity to a contribution. The individual giving over time since 1979 has declined from 83 to 70% of the total giving. Private foundations picking up most of that slack. And again, that's partly through the creation of new foundations. It's through the asset growth, through investment management, other purposes of foundations. And on the individual side, while that 70% looks like a block of people, there are lots of different types of donors in there doing all different kinds of things. But in general, what it shows you is we've got a broad and diverse base of support for philanthropy in the US, with some of those endowed vehicles really carrying a heavier load in terms of their overall support for the very generous giving that happens every year.
Don, are you seeing any change in those numbers this year because of COVID?
Yeah, it's a great question, Barry. So a couple of trends that I'll call out. There is a specific set of donors that we see that are more challenged with the COVID environment. And a lot of those are folks who have been directly impacted, typically folks that historically have had enough wealth to make general contributions on a regular basis, who might be unemployed, feeling duress, or in some ways not having that same source of income. So we're seeing that, I'd call it more of a retail-based donor-based challenge. And that is a significant driver of the philanthropy in the US. As a corollary, we're seeing more foundations stepping forward, and they're actually upping their giving in general, not keeping flat, but deciding to ride through the market. You have groups like the Ford Foundation that have looked for ways to do bond financings as a way to free up capital now to support additional giving, knowing that there will be a payoff down the road that they expect to support through additional market growth, et cetera, knowing that's not possible today. The other thing I would share with you, there's a wonderful study that the University of Pennsylvania put forward a couple of years ago about donor advised funds during times of duress or stress to their communities, and that the donors behind those funds becoming more prolific in their giving. We are seeing that today for sure. I tell you, with the bank's charitable gift fund, we are up almost 50% on average from last year, massive amount. And that's both the number and the value of donations going out from the donor advised fund. Similarly, I know Schwab has reported that same number through June in a recent study that they produced as well. And anecdotally, I will tell you, we are seeing individual donors more generous, those with endowed pockets to pull from, stepping forward more aggressively, those depending on their annual income, more challenged to do so, and in some cases declining.
And is that money staying locally, or is it going national or international? Do you see a trend there?
Yeah, it's so from my lens, Barry, and it's tough. A lot of my donors, they'd like to give to their communities. Sometimes they're primary residence. Some of them have secondary, even tertiary residences. Most of it appears, our experience has been US based this year, some international, but generally speaking, it's been in support of their local communities, which is not super different from prior years. To be honest, the only time we see real distinction is national disasters or acts of nature that are unforeseen.
Like hurricanes and fires and exactly what we've been going through with a pandemic at the same time.
You got it. Earlier this year, we did see a boost towards California in support of the wildfire and some of the good relief efforts going on out there, for example.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So can you take us back a little bit? Tell us the history. When did donor advised funds first start? How have they evolved? And tell us what's driving the change.
Sure. And it's a great question. It's funny when you ask most people about donor advised funds. I mentioned many donors didn't even know about them a year ago. If you look at the popular press, you'll feel like, wow, look at what's going on. All this talk around donor advised fund. The reality is that they've been around quite a while. Back since the 30s was the start of the first one from the New York Community Trust. And donor advised funds at that time were really started as a way, I'd almost call it partnered giving. It was where you had charities, community foundations, and frankly, very high-end universities, the Dartmouths, the Harvards, et cetera, where they had donors that were very loyal donors to them and their causes, but they saw an opportunity to support the giving of those donors more broadly in a way to be more closely connected. In the case of a university, you might see giving to a certain nation and realize, well, gosh, we have a wonderful curriculum around that nation and its culture. There's a chance to further connect with that donor and their family. So it really started as almost a secondary relationship developing tool. What we've seen the transition occur is that donor advised funds have gone from being a sidecar for many donors to being their primary vehicle. And as a result, you've seen that marketplace responding. And why that's happened, it's really born out of a couple of thoughts. Advisors have changed, and they've changed the way that they're engaging their clients. I'll speak more about that toward later in the discussion, but in simple terms, there are different types and a greater range of advisors engaging donors. It's no longer just trust and estates attorneys and tax accountants. You have financial advisors, you have philanthropic specialists, all different types of folks that are out there. And secondarily, you have donors that are frankly demanding more of those advisors, really looking for opportunities to gain knowledge, experience, and think about how they might do things differently. And that's all backstopped by the fact that donors historically hadn't been as interested, relatively, about giving for impact during their lives, but often thought about philanthropy and endowed philanthropy as an end-of-life exercise for someone else to carry on for them. That is overturned over the last few decades. Donors are active during their lifetimes, and they're demanding more of advisors who are becoming more knowledgeable and bringing better solutions back.
Great. Can you talk to us about the three areas, entities that hold donor advised funds? We'd have to go on to slide 10 for that.
Sure. Yeah, and Barry, it's a great frame. So there really are a couple of different types, and this is a generic categorization, but it's a pretty good bucket. There's a wonderful organization, the National Philanthropic Trust, that every year puts out a compendium, a study of the donor advised fund space. And they really have taken the lead in bringing some transparency and data to this sector that prior to their studies really hadn't been well looked at. And effectively, there are three types of what we call donor advised fund sponsor organizations. The first are the national charities. Most of those are really driven by groups like the bank or Fidelity, where there's a national financial company that is sponsoring a donor advised fund. It is a single purpose entity whose job is really to facilitate giving to the charitable sector. It's what they do. They have a national footprint. They aren't as focused on the specific direction of grants, but more so about supporting donors and supporting philanthropy in the charitable sector at large. What you'll see is if you look at some of the numbers on this slide very quickly, they are the big players in this industry today. And that's been one of the changes. Fidelity was the first of these, and they came on board in the early 90s. And since that time, they've introduced a whole bunch of innovations that we can talk about in a bit that have led them to take over the majority of the market share here. Expediency, tech, as I mentioned, lower cost fees, and just a real simplicity for donors that are looking to engage around their giving without a lot of guidance. The second group are community foundations. And I'm going to hope most of the folks on the phone are connected to their community foundations, know what they are, what they do. but they're effectively foundations that are geographically defined. They have a catchment area, and their job is really to support the impactful needs of that community, whether it's economic development, it's poverty relief, it's employment. It could be a combination of all those things: housing, transportation, the arts, really with a focus on that specific defined geography. They are the legacy donor advised fund sponsors. The New York Community Trust I mentioned is one of those, and they really have used donor advised funds as a partner vehicle to other funds that they have to support the impacts in their local communities. The third type are single issue charities, and these very often will be groups that are affiliated with some religious segment, where they're looking at an affiliation through religion or cause-based affiliation, and folks are looking to both have the benefit of supporting the causes that are related to the affiliation, but also commingling and sharing with other donors who share that affiliation with them. Now, I won't get into all the numbers here, but I did the quick math. I won't trust everybody to have done it. But if you do the average account size here, one thing you will realize when people talk about donor advised fund and their magnitude, the average account size for the national charity DAFs is about $120,000. For the community foundations, it's about 3.5 times bigger. And for the single issue charities, about 2 times bigger. So there fundamentally are typically different types of donors underneath each of those sponsor types, and different models for supporting them as a result.
Is it unusual for donors to have more than one donor advised fund, say with Bank of America and also with a community foundation?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Barry, I'll give the typical planner's answer. It depends. So for many clients, it does. It's all contextual. Some may be looking to literally spread their money. Others may be looking to seed funds for their kids and grandkids, and they prefer to go where those children or grandchildren's money already is. Others may have a desire to support an affiliation, and they're very prominent in one fund there, but they also want to maintain the flexibility to not feel constrained by those affiliations, whether it's a geography-based one through a community foundation or a single issue fund where there's no rule that they have to give to the mission of that entity, but their inclination generally would be to. But many of them also just maintain one.
How common is it that someone will establish a donor advised fund to help children or grandchildren understand how philanthropy works? It's really theirs to give away.
Absolutely. It really is much more common than you would guess, and with a couple of contexts. One, where you have a family of significant wealth and you have the ability for a succession plan of significant wealth, typically in the form of a private foundation. Donor advised funds can very often be used as, I hate to call it this, but somewhat of a training ground or a room for independence, where a child or a grandchild can have that freedom to pursue their own passions, determine their own charitable goals, and frankly find the best strategies for reaching those goals, prior to the family saying, we want to introduce you as an equal voting board member or the successor trustee for $100 million, $200, $500 million foundation. For lower wealth clients and families, it's not as typical. Simply scales usually based on the level of complexity of a family's wealth. And Barry, one other quick thing I will mention, the fourth group of DAFs that I didn't call out, which again is that one of the first groups that started, universities. If you wonder about how frequent these are out there, do a Google search for donor advised fund and university, and you will see the number of universities that are proactively encouraging their donors to set up a donor advised fund with them, where a prescribed percentage of the gifts have to stay with that charity and the rest can be distributed broadly. We have other donors that will use those vehicles for their children based on where they went to school or where they are intending to have them go to school over time.
Thank you. On the screen, we've got a couple other questions. Perhaps you could jump in and address these.
Sure. So the growth in donor advised fund use, it's really been driven by a couple of things. And I've touched on some of them, so I won't belabor it. But number one, it's a growing awareness, absolutely, from advisors about the utility of donor advised funds. In the advisor world, there has historically been a thought that donor advised fund might really only be for a retail level of wealth. That was one bias that was out there. Also that they didn't offer the flexibility that a private foundation does in terms of control, structure, all of which is true. But increasingly what we've seen is that more advisors are finding the benefits, the individual benefits of a donor advised fund, are able to put them beside other giving opportunities to donors, whether it be a direct gift to a university or a homeless shelter, a Boys and Girls Club, setting up your own private foundation. And as a result, you're seeing more folks opt for that because it fits their context better. Number two benefit for the growth has really been about donors themselves. And we are seeing a very strong increase in the number of donors that are eschewing pay for advice service models, if you will. And what they're really looking for is someone who can quickly, efficiently allow me to make my contribution, document it for tax purposes, and engage in my giving over time productively. I'm not looking for someone to tell me who to give it to, how much and where, when, but rather things that I'd like to keep the decision making on. And very often that is a great fit for donor advised funds. We also are seeing an increasing level of folks, I won't say demanding, but almost requiring 24/7 access and the benefits of technology. Can I go in? Can I share this with my spouse? Can I introduce my kids to this? I have a kid in San Francisco, New York, and Atlanta. Can I have all three of them participate? Absolutely. So that's the second piece, is really the donor demand and need for the support. The third one has been some of the introductions that have been brought by those national charities. And again, it's about scale, cost diminishment, simplicity. We run into many donors these days over the last 10 years who have gone ahead and set up a private foundation, thinking that was the right approach for their families. And it may well have been at the time, but they've learned that the administrative costs, the hassle and time spent preparing returns, filings, and doing the administrative work that's required has kind of taken the joy out of their giving. And they've realized that coming to a giving vehicle where all that is taken care of at a top of the house level, that doesn't require them to involve themselves or frankly pay for it directly, makes it a lot simpler for them.
Thank you. So if I'm representing a not-for-profit organization and we would like to look at donor advised funds as a possible pool of money, they don't advertise. Do I go talk to somebody at a bank or a community foundation and say, well, if you've got some donor advised funds that like the kind of thing we're doing, whether it's theater or hospice or whatever, how do people access the money? And that clearly brings us into the next slide.
Sure. So Barry, let me take a step back. I'm going to segue these two questions from a donor perspective. If you think about what are some of the benefits and how are they using them, because it will come directly to the answer to your question. When I think about a donor advised fund, fundamentally what it is, it's a giving vehicle, much like a private foundation, much like a charitable gift annuity, much like a charitable remainder trust. It is the structure by which the charitable dollars are housed until given, right? Simple terms. When you look at the benefits for donors there, it gives donors, as I mentioned, the ability to very simply make their permanent contributions to charity. Once a gift is given to a donor advised fund, it can never be taken back. Once that gift is accepted, it is dedicated to charity, whether it's tomorrow, in a year, 10 years, etc. So there's a benefit there. The simplicity of getting that whole thing set up, very important for them. The other thing that it allows them to do is to also look at a broad range of assets they can contribute. They could contribute, literally we've had strip malls contributed. You can look at appreciated securities. You can look at cash. You can look at oil and gas rights, private equity holdings, all that good stuff. And as a result, all of those benefits that donors are looking for doesn't change the fact that the donors are looking to have those gifts distributed to the charities that they care about. Now, the standard is that those charities obviously have to be in good standing with the IRS, and that the purposes can't be one that derives personal benefit back to the donors. Okay, so that's the context for why donors see some value here. So coming back to your question, the most common call I get that I cannot satisfy from a donor, a charity when they call, is can you introduce me to your donor advised fund donors? And what I would ask folks to think about is, again, the donor advised fund is really the vehicle by which the funds are available to be distributed, but that is a closed environment where the donors have asked for those funds to be segregated and are looking to then advise on how they're given out over time. Donor advised funds may have some small pools of general funds, that could be distributed at the discretion of the sponsor without any input from the advisor. But in general terms, it's almost like the Carter Center or another charity being asked by a third charity, hey, can I meet all of your donors? I'd really like to talk to them and tell them about the great things we do, et cetera. Might be the right thing to do, might be a good thing, not the first instinct for most groups. So I would say that the benefit for charities, in the slide that you referenced, if we could just flip to it quickly, there's been a little bit of discontent out in the nonprofit world. We hear some headlines suggesting that donor advice funds are great, they're simple, easy to work with, and others that feel like, wow, they're standing in the way of my charity and charitable dollars. I give 3 pieces of advice here. Number one, this is a brand new study from the Lilly Center on Philanthropy, sponsored by the Schwab Charitable Gift Fund. And they did a study of nonprofits and said, for those of you that have worked with nonprofits, tell us about it. How did it go? What was it like, et cetera? Well, we framed for you just a couple of key findings here. You will see that 87% of the organizations that solicited gifts got that. And that's soliciting through donors or not yet donors, but people that had donor advised funds, not by soliciting the donor advised fund institution itself. The 42% that did not also got gifts. So those that knew people and knew they had DAFs as a potential pool of funds that they might draw upon or call upon for gifts, great success. And the second is a whole bunch that weren't expecting it also got them. And that pie chart at the bottom is a really important one, contact with donors. Well, one of the claims that can be raised by a nonprofit is that donor advised funds prevent a charity from recognizing Barry Nicholsburg as a donor through his donor advised fund and come back. Now, donor advised funds, very often, they will allow donors the ability to be anonymous in their giving. The vast majority of them choose not to be. And on each gift, it will say that this is from the Bank of America Charitable Gift Fund, from the Barry Nicholsburg Donor Advised Fund account. And as a result, Barry also will have the choice of indicating that he'd like to be contacted and thanked or recognized for his support of the charity. Then ultimately, that charity has the ability, they'll get the information from the Donor Advised Fund to reach back to Barry. And so my counsel, this is my learning for charities, is that thinking of donor advised funds as competition to me feels very unfounded. It's about the donors and what donors are seeking. And where we see charities having success in seeing this trend toward donor advised fund giving and no diminishment in it, it's that they're concentrating their efforts on the relationship depth they have with donors, their ability to solicit and secure new donors, and ultimately, and most importantly, their ability to very tangibly communicate how they are driving impact. And with those basic principles in mind, which are not in your heads, they're no different than how you would raise funds for your charity from a foundation or from direct giving. That is the best way to leverage those relationships, is making sure that your fundamentals are strong and your donor relations are first and foremost.
What drives me crazy, I'm getting some echo. When I look at reports or I watch presentations like this, and it's currently October of 2020, and their statistics are from June of 2004, or they really feel good because it's May of 2009, and they really pat themselves on the back when they get to 2012. A lot of the reason that I am so gobsmacked by Don Greene is the date that's on this, and it's Don, you are always current. The statistics, the report you're showing here is only 8 days old, and so we have great confidence that these numbers reflect current thinking, not what was a decade ago. And I applaud you for it. You're very consistent that way.
Thank you.
Could we go, Mark, could we jump to slide 14? Because I think the questions on 13 have already been answered pretty well. Don?
Absolutely. So what is this slide and why do we have it here? First of all, this is a wonderful slide from a study that we conducted the bank in partnership with the Philanthropic Initiative, which is a program of the Boston Foundation. And what we were endeavoring to do was really understand why donors give. So fundamentally, when questions come up about donor advised funds and how they work, why they work, et cetera, it always starts with the donor. What is the donor trying to achieve? How do they achieve things? Similarly, we recognize that very often these donors are accompanied by one or many different types of advisors. And so we thought it was important to also see, how do advisors think those donors think, and how do they help support them? So this study is really meant to represent those two audiences. So you'll see the top charts here. The blue is about the professional advisors, your trust and estates attorney, tax accountants, financial advisors, et cetera. How do they think their clients are doing their giving? And this is really for the high net worth segment, which the numbers tend to drive most of the giving in the US. And then the maroon chart, or bar, excuse me, are for the actual donors themselves. The good news is, first of all, if you look across the top, it's not super different about why they believe donors are giving, for sure. And you'll see it's passionate about a cause, desire to give back, impact in the community world. And what I like to flag for folks, and this is absolutely true with my experience working with clients, the reason people are giving is because they are charitably committed, period, end of story. The other benefits come, right? And there are other things that go with it. And you'll see that second set of charts where the disconnect starts to show is advisors think that their clients are more worried about reducing their taxes, the family legacy, making sure their name gains some prominence, et cetera. And while those may be residual benefits, they're clearly secondary, tertiary, quaternary benefits or reasons why we see net wealthy donors actually giving their money away. And that's an important starting point, is the charity is really why they're doing what they're doing, and that's been consistent. Now, the last couple of boxes at the bottom are similar. When you look at tax policy and what donors tell us, and this is just us asking and them telling us, and you could be skeptical and say, well, they're not telling the truth, or you could take them at face value. But high net worth donors, and this is consistent with history, their giving is not actually variable on taxation. The amount may be variable to some degree, but their intent and their dedication, it's very much like a staple good, a food, of shelter. They budget for it. They make the allocation. It's not like a luxury item that in good years, yeah, maybe I'll get one. Bad years, not so much. And so that's a really important frame, I think, when we think about what's behind the motivation of the donors coming. They are allocating a significant portion of funds to a permanent charitable purpose. That's the first chart. So, and Barry, maybe if we can jump to the next one.
Yes.
And so as we get into this, one of the questions I often get is, okay, so that's great to know. Donors are generous. They have been for decades, and there are more vehicles available. So how do we go about that? Well, one of the big changes we've seen, and one of the drivers of this growth that I hinted at, is that it hasn't actually been about the donors, mysteriously. It's been about the advisors. And that advisors increasingly, first of all, I mentioned there's a larger party of advisors now, different types, that are being asked to be valuable in different ways. And they are looking at clients holistically, no longer, if you will, just staying in their swim lane in terms of trying to solve issues, but bringing expertise, guidance, thoughts to families. And what you will see is that these families who are looking for more advice around philanthropy now have a larger pool of advisors who recognize, wow, those families really are interested and need help. And they are actually educating themselves and becoming more knowledgeable about philanthropy. That's step one. As they do that, and it doesn't mean they have to develop the expertise themselves, but they know where to go, how to introduce the right conversations. As they bring those conversations to clients, they see that it helps them do better with those clients. They see that it helps them win new clients. And they've realized that, wow, beyond this one situation, I'm going to start doing this with all of my clients. I want to talk to them about philanthropy. Not 5 meetings in once I've got a grip on everything, but right away. I want to know why they give. What do they care about? What are their plans for their kids and grandkids around giving? All of those issues that pop up where it used to be, yeah, let me tell them which asset is the most tax advantaged to contribute this year. Now it's about impact, why they have concern, et cetera. And as we've seen those advisors change their practices, having success, more of the industry is following. So in simple terms, I see advisors really being that catalyst that's helping more and more donors unlock their giving in bigger and better ways. And so that really is the fundamental story for me about where the growth is ultimately coming from. And it's helping advisors become more valuable to the greater effect that philanthropy becomes part of the way that those families see themselves. And as a result, the advisors are now seeing them where they may not have in the past. Now, if I could, really quickly, as I think about some of the numbers on this chart, they're overwhelmingly positive when you think about it. There still is a disconnect that I would say, and there's room for advisors to grow here, where still the majority of advisors who say, hey, I did talk to my client about philanthropy, many of them still are talking about which asset to get rid of, right? And that could be part of the story, but more and more of them are realizing that to the client, that's not a discussion about philanthropy. That's a discussion about wealth management, accounting, tax planning. When they say they want to talk about philanthropy, they want to talk about causes, impact, supports, peer learning, models that they're seeing in other countries or other parts of the country itself.
I want to jump in with a question here. You had mentioned a few slides back that people could create a DAF or fund a DAF with a strip mall. And how do you do that? How does that work?
Sure. So, so one of the great democratizing factors of donor advised funds, first of all, they've opened up endowed giving to almost any donor in the U.S., where you can open an account for a minimum of dollars, right? But for the charities themselves too, what donor advised funds, particularly the national players, and again, I'll use the bank as a reference, we have capabilities in the bank that allows us to accept a very broad range of assets. Most nonprofits will have an gift acceptance policy, and it's going to be much more narrow because they don't have the expertise to take in assets of a certain type and sell them. So these national donor advised funds have developed the expertise where they can take in assets and vary, whether it's real estate like a strip mall, it could be oil and gas rights, it could be timberland, and it could be a hedge fund holding. Because we have the ability to access the capital markets for all of those types of assets, we give every nonprofit the opportunity to enjoy the value of those assets. So you can see donors' wealth across the board, not just through traditional securities, and those funds can now be distributed down to the end charities, where in the past they wouldn't have been able to take it as a gift on their own.
And now, if the value, I know that with COVID running rampant, lots of malls, large and small, are hurting. Has that affected the value of that property?
Absolutely. So, I probably, as using strip malls, I don't want to pretend there are hundreds of them running in the door to DAPs. They're not. But conceptually, the way it works is you have an asset, it could be real estate or something else. You have to then, as the donor, go solicit a valuation from independent valuator. And it is your job to represent that value to the IRS. The recipient donor advised fund will do that research on the asset itself too, to make sure it is not an asset that becomes an encumbrance. And remember, their missions are to liquidate and distribute funds to charity. So they don't have an interest generally in holding on to assets any longer than needed. Many of them, for example, we have standards by which we will accept assets of a certain term because we don't want to be holding assets for decades, even 5 or 10 years, to be honest with you, because the funds for our DAF are meant to really go to distribute out to charities at the end of the day. But it's simple, where the donor has to activate the asset to contribute. They have to produce the valuation for themselves for determination with the IRS. They have to get the acceptance from the charity to make sure that they will take the asset, it's a good one. And very often the charity, the donor advised fund, will look for some assurance from the donor, Barry, that in the event that the strip mall value went down, the donor is willing to take it back at a purchase price equivalent to the gift price. Very often that's a guarantee that we would look to.
Interesting. I did not know that.
All to protect the integrity of the charity, the donor advised.
Great. Thank you. Mark, I have clearly asked way too many questions here, and you must have some questions for Don that I haven't asked yet. You're muted.
Yes, thank you both. And what an excellent time. We do have a few questions from the audience that I'd like to go ahead and pose to you guys. Feel free to talk around them, both of you. So the first question that we've got comes in, it asks, so if the organization is a not-for-profit organization in Canada, but not a charitable organization, could a donor-advised fund be used to make a gift to that international organization?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the standards that you would think about is really does the donor advised fund you are looking to enable grants to ex-US charities fundamentally. In the case of the Bank of America Charitable Gift Fund, we do focus on US charities overseen by the IRS. So unfortunately, that wouldn't be a good fit for our donor advised fund. However, there are two options that we see. There are some internationally based donor advised funds that specifically serve as intermediaries for taking donations from US entities and moving them to charities that are outside the US. I'd be happy to get you a short list of those groups. They're proficient at what they do. They're great at what they do, very professional. That's number one. The second is very often those charities, if I think of Bermudan charities, for example, very often Bermudan corporations have limited allowances for how long a US citizen can be an executive of a Bermuda corporation. So as a result, you have a rotation of US execs who come in and out of those charities. They become embroiled in that community they want to give. Charities in Bermuda very often will set up a friends of entity in the US as a permanent way to raise funds as well. More complicated, a little bit more investment required, but either option would be a potential depending on what density of contributions you're looking for.
Wonderful, Don. Thank you so much for the great context and depth there. I'd like to ask too, another question that we've got came in. It actually looks like two questions. First, are donor advised funds secured against losses?
So I'm not going to, let me try to interpret the question first, and then I'll answer the question that I've interpreted. So as far as losses, donor advised funds allow donations to come in and then be invested until they're distributed to the end charity. If the question is whether or not the principal, so let's say $1 million was contributed and the stock market goes down 20%, is the donor advised fund insured to that $1 million? Absolutely not. For better or for worse, like any charity's investments, they will suffer the downside of the market and the upside. We know historically there has been a consistent upside over time, over longevity, but there is no guarantee, much like a gift to an endowed fund at a university or a hospital would be guaranteed for that donor. Excellent. Now, what I can say, Mark, sorry, one quick thing. Sure. The gift, though, the minute the gift is given, the value of that gift is established in the eyes of the IRS. So even if the market declines prior to those funds being given to the end charity, the deduction value is based upon the timing of the receipt of the gift. That does not vary. So in some sense, that is insured, even though it's not insurance. It's just a law.
Excellent. Reading between the lines on the question, I think you've probably addressed it fully, and I've made the offer to our audience. If they have more specific questions, I'll be happy to try to get them in touch with you or pass info back and forth, however we can get it done. So I'd like to go on to the second part of that question, and it continues. How frequently are recommended charities denied as DAF recipients? And could you speak to some of the reasons, perhaps, for why that might happen, why there might be denial?
Yeah, sure. Another great question. It's different by donor advised fund. Each donor advised fund can set its own standards, but generally speaking, donor advised funds will look to the IRS as its first stop. Is the charity one that is in good standing with the IRS? Number one, is it a charity? And if the answer is no, I'll come back to that in a minute. If the answer is yes, is it in good standing and can that be verified? And can that be verified at the time of the request? Generally speaking, that will give some sense that the charity is qualified. A number of donor advised funds, includes ours, also recognize that there are some groups that have achieved charitable status that, how should I frame it? They aren't necessarily always oriented around a charitable mission or outcome. And I think of hate speech as one good example. Groups that are out there fomenting unrest and racism, structural inequities in society. Some of us do rely upon groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center to confirm that we don't have a group that might still be on the IRS list. Maybe it's coming off, maybe it's not, but it does fit into the nomenclature of a group promoting hate speech that we don't support. So that's one example. The second I would give, so remember I first said, are they registered with the IRS? If the answer is no, very often the no is because it is a religious organization. And many donor advised funds, or some I should say, including ours, we do look at religious organizations as ones that are worthy of support. And the IRS standard is that you have to document that they are the equivalent of a charity. where their standards could be IRS confirmation, but in this case, you don't have that. So you have to go through a bunch of extra steps and work to do that. We've taken that on. We accept that welcomingly. We recognize how important religious entities are to our communities, also to our donors. We also recognize the real challenge. Religious entities have seen a drop off in membership, and the real giving from individuals for them has dropped by 4% over the last 2 years. And so taking away the ability for them to find support through our DAF isn't something we would entertain. But those are a couple of clean examples. I will suggest when we turn down a charity or a grant, for example, it is more often than not because the purpose is not a correct one or an allowable one that gives us comfort. Occasionally we'll get a charity that we either can't validate, won't validate, or the IRS has said, no, this is a group that has had their charitable status taken away. But more often than not, the donor has mistakenly asked for something or directed in a way that would not be appropriate. And frankly, would call into validity the value of their deduction, which could invoke penalties and all kinds of bad things.
Of course. Would you mind maybe adding just a little bit of additional detail on what kinds of things might be not in a sort of a proper purpose?
Yeah, sure. So you may have a donor who comes and use some of these examples earlier. They might ask for a partial charitable gift. They may be used to making a personal gift to their local hospital gala, and they're looking to claim the value of the meal doesn't count, but the excess value does count. You can't do that through a donor advised fund. So that would be an immediate rejection. You could have a donor who decides that they want to give to a particular purpose. We will often find somebody who very well intentioned wants to give money to a charity that is sponsoring their nephew or teenager on an overseas mission. Not something we can do, something that's a directed purpose with a direct personal benefit back. The other one we get is often very mistakenly memberships or something that connotes almost a membership, whether the donor is aware that there's a benefit or not, where we are looking at the grant and realize, well, the donor actually gets this back, can't allow those.
That's extremely helpful, Don. Thank you very much. I do have another question here for you also. Someone has asked, why would anyone use a donor advised fund other than as an alternative, say maybe for wealthy families creating a foundation? Are there tax benefits? The person notes that nearly all of the times that they're giving annually, approximately 100 times a year, the value of the gift is, $100 or less. Could you speak to that, Don?
Sure. So let me start with the major benefit for donor advised funds is that their deductibility is equivalent to giving to a public charity, a school, a museum, or hospital. So it gives you the potential for maximum deductibility. For example, an appreciated stock of Apple actually gets you a deduction at the market value of the deduction. Just don't liquidate it. Give the stock itself, and that's one of the major benefits. The other couple of benefits, I'll give you a few scenarios. With some of the recent changes in the tax code, fewer Americans are itemizing their deductions, meaning they're not qualified by virtue of their annual deductions to reach a threshold. Well, a number of folks, and these are not the high-flying, wealthiest folks in the world, they have determined that I may be able to cluster my giving, effectively give away 5 times what I do in a normal year into a donor advised fund, so I can do an itemized deduction. And then I will use that money over the next 5 years through the DAF to support my giving. We've also seen family members look to each other and realize, well, hey, gosh, I'd love to give and contribute with you. A donor advised fund allows you to invite others to participate in your account. And so whether it's a lot of money or a little, our grants are as small as $250 with the Bank of America Charitable Gift Fund. And one of the biggest benefits we get back from our clients is that come April 15th, guess who is not scrambling to find their tax receipts, reaching out to charities? It's documented, it's online. Everything they need is in one spot, simple, takes care of all the administrative hassle.
Fantastic, Don. Thank you very much for that. I've actually got another question that's kind of like a follow-on to that. And it's specifically asking, again, about are there any specific times or scenarios where we might actually have an advisor who would recommend the use of a donor advised fund, life events, one-time things like that might be worth thinking about this tool?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Typically, again, most of the clients that would come looking for a donor advised fund have some level of endowed commitment. And when I say endowed, it does not mean permanence. Most donor advised funds, to be honest, the dollar contributed today will be spent within 3 to 5 years with the end charity. They are not necessarily, Oh my gosh, on average, easily. Plenty of studies that will indicate for that. In fact, you will see if you look at the asset value of assets coming in and assets leaving, a well-documented UPenn study, 85% of all dollars coming into donor advised funds on average flow right back out that same year in the form of grants. Not necessarily the same dollar, right? But on average, the dollars in and the dollars out are different by 15%. Not huge. So that's the first comment that I would offer. The second thing is that very often you will have life events. It could be the sale of a family business, family that might have spent years, decades, generations building a business. And that source of wealth is really meant to sustain the family for generations, whether it's personal wealth or charitable. And some folks will set up an endowed structure where they intend those funds to last virtually in perpetuity, just like a nonprofit endowment, where the 5% income or whatever rate you choose would be spent down. But we have other donors that will have situations where there is a one-time event of a death in the family, or there may be a smaller sale of a business or a portion of a private equity or hedge fund, and they want to set up an endowed structure for 5-10 years, almost like a sunsetting foundation. One data point I'll give you to have an instinct for this is if you look at economic indicators and see what the donor advised fund industry's asset growth is most closely correlated to, it is most closely correlated to private equity and venture fund liquidations.
That's remarkable.
Right?
Yeah, that's a remarkable thing to think about. Immediately in my mind, I guess I thought to one example you mentioned about perhaps a sale of a family business or something like that. That makes a lot of sense how it could be then incorporated into a planning strategy. So one thing, I know we're sort of coming short on time here. We've got about 4 minutes left. So Don, I wanted to ask, is there anything that you'd like to say to the folks out there listening, any parting advice you might have or comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mark, and a couple of thoughts, and I'll just reemphasize a couple themes. Number one, donor advised funds to me, I'm from the philanthropic sector all my professional career, foundations, public charities, donor advised funds. I support them all today in my current role at the bank. I'd like to think I don't have a bias in any one direction, right? That's my starting point. But donor advised funds represent a really unique and powerful tool for donors, for advisors, and ultimately for charities as a way of really democratizing philanthropy. They've opened up the doors to endowed giving for all different segments of wealth that was never available before, except to the wealthiest of people in the country, or frankly, the donors to the wealthiest universities in the country. That's all changed, and that's a very real, tangible benefit. The second is that the donor advised funds have also found a way to really streamline and centralize all the administrative hassle and cost to minimize the need to spend money to satisfy all the reporting requirements, et cetera. One tax return, one financial audit, right? Saving that work and cost for the donor. And ultimately, what that's done is it's driven down the cost of donor advised funds, so there's more money left for charities. For advisors, what I would encourage is that there is an opportunity, a growing opportunity, where more and more donors, think of Gen X even, folks don't think of themselves just in terms of their wealth anymore. They think of their spending as part of who they are, and philanthropy and social impact charity. You have the ability to reshape your practice to make sure that philanthropy is part of the discussion. Donor advised funds are just one club in the bag if you're a golfer, right? Or one tool in the toolbox.
Fantastic.
And the key is
analogy.
understanding what they are, how they can be complements. And I would encourage you, we have lots of clients that use multiple vehicles for multiple purposes because it depends. Client context will dictate whether you have the right tool in hand or not to offer them. But don't think about bias in the way that you've always done things or thought of things. There really is a much broader set of capabilities out there to support folks.
Don, thank you ever so much. You have been a wealth of information. At the top of the hour, I said you'd be drinking from, I told our audience they'd be drinking from a fire hose. Now you know that it was true. If you would like to get a hold of me or Mark, and you have the PowerPoint, you can just click on either of those cards and it will take you directly to our email, or you can give us a call, even though everyone at the Carter Center is working from his or her respective homes. Our phones are forwarded directly to our mobile phones. We will still pick up the call. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. Two quick things. You might ask your advisor if he or she is a chartered advisor in philanthropy. And if not, perhaps that individual would at least look at the program out of the American College. There's a gentleman named Phil Kubetta who has created this incredible education program specifically for advisors and others. Well worth looking into, for sure. On Monday, we will be back here at 5 p.m. Eastern Time with Chuck Collins, who wrote the book Born on Third Base, and he's also others. He is going to talk about some of the unintended uses of donor-advised funds and potential reforms. And we hope that you can join us for that, a very different discussion than what we've had today. If you have additional questions, please don't hesitate to either call or email me or Mark. If you have them for Don, we will funnel them through to him. On behalf of President and Mrs. Carter, I'd like to thank you for spending the last hour with us. God bless.